Well, for the first time ever, we heard a stereo mix of the Beach Boys' classic 1968 single, Do It Again. That, along with, 200 or so other songs, can be found on the new Beach Boys box set, Made in California, which came out this past Tuesday. I have to tell you, I had a heck of a time finding a record store that carried this box set, but I did manage to get it. And there's so many great things on here. David Beard of Endless Summer Quarterly joins us once again. He was on about a month ago for our Beach Boys Bash. And I thought we'd have, a conversation about what's on the box set, and maybe we could play some of our favorite Beach Boys cuts and maybe our favorites of the unreleased material on the box set. You know, it comes packaged in what looks like a high school yearbook. It's really well done. You know, you've got all these great photos and memories. And, David, what did you think of the packaging?
It's impressive. I mean, it does feel like a yearbook. You know, give credit to everyone who worked on it. You know, that's the same thing as I would give credit to the Grammy Award-winning team for the Smile Sessions. You know, you're talking about Alan Boyd, Mark Lynette, from an audio standpoint. You're talking about Mark London from a design standpoint, as well as Dennis Wolfe. I know Andrew Sandoval was involved on this. It's almost like they took a little bit of last year's tour book.
I see. Okay.
Concept, because if you have that tour book, as soon as you open up the cover, you had the yearbook shots. And it's almost like they took that vibe and kind of held on to this 50th thing. What do you do when you have like a marker like that? Well, it's a reunion. It was a reunion last year, and sometimes you go to your high school reunion. So it's kind of like that same type of thought process and vibe, and it's really, on that level, it's just super cool.
Well, I thought we could play some songs from the box set, as I mentioned before to the audience. 2 favorites each, 2 favorite Beach Boys classics, and our 2 favorites of the unreleased material that's now surfacing on the box set. And I thought I'd start off with my all-time favorite Beach Boys song. To me, this is as perfect a pop song as you can make. From 1964, I Get Around. Listen to this. In the box set, you get a little bit of session chatter before the song starts. Listen.
All right, here we go. Just wait. Start the first song.
The Beach Boys with I Get Around on the Vintage Rockin' Pop Shop as we take a look at some of the songs on the new Made in California box set. David, you're up next. What's your selection?
It has to be my favorite Beach Boys song of all time, and that's Cabanescence. And that was originally, as you and I know, the listeners may not know this, but it was originally written in '66 and came out in the Smile Sessions. You know, and Smile, of course, included Good Vibrations and Heroes and Villains. But this is just a song to me. When you listen to it, it's like a great painting, kind of like the Fresh Impressionists would paint. It's a great American storytelling of it's kind of 3 pieces, and the verses are called Home on the Range, and you kind of can picture Ma and Pa Kettle sitting on the front porch in a couple of wooden rocking chairs, kind of looking out over the prairie and watching them work on the railroad. And then the next section, I guess it's a chorus, is Who Ran the Iron Horse, which is about the very first, locomotive that they brought across, the pounding of the Golden Spike that connected the transatlantic connector there for the train, and east to west. And then at the end, it's Have You Seen the Grand Coulee Dam, which is another great, architectural, phenomenon. And then you'll hear that with Working on the Railroad, and then over and over the crow cries, Uncover the Cornfield. Now, that's an unusual lyric, but that also just speaks they're using a bird in this particular situation, but it's kind of just talking about a man coming out west, putting up a farm, working on the farm, going over the cornfield with, a thresher and a wheat field, and you're just harvesting your crops. And it's a very wonderful, dynamic telling of the Old West.
We just heard Cabanescence by the Beach Boys. That was David's pick from the box set. Of course, Cabinessence, as we mentioned, was supposed to be on the Beach Boys' Smile album, that version, recorded in 1966, although in 1969 an overdubbed version of that song was released on the Beach Boys' 2020 album, which had so many great songs on it, like I Can Hear Music and Do It Again, Be With Me, Cotton Fields, Time to Get Alone. I mean, the Beach Boys catalog is an embarrassment of riches. The interesting thing about that song, in 1966 and going into 1967, the birth of psychedelic music seemed to focus on an almost Edwardian style and sensibility, this sort of celebration of merry old England. And yet here's Brian in 1966 going in the opposite direction, and it's all pioneer spirit and westward ho, and it's almost a kind of psychedelic Americana.
Yeah, and that had a lot to do with Van Dyke Park.
Yeah.
Originally, I think from Mississippi area, and he came out there. So part of Van Dyke's life at that point was a young man coming from the east to the west, and he was familiar with the Appalachians mountains over, in the North Carolina mountains, and so he had that idea to Brian is let's create this let's use the Beach Boys as the platform, because Beach Boys are America's band. Now, of course, the term America's band didn't come until the early 80s,
right?
Really, from the Reagans. But you go back to that time, they were kind of this group that was, of all of the groups out of America in the mid-'60s, they were at the top of their game. They were the one that everyone was paying attention to. Particularly Brian. Brian was the guy that everyone was paying attention to. And the group themselves would go, as you know, would go out and tour. They'd come back and they'd be like, "Whoa, what's this now?"
Right.
And that would always happen. I mean, when he stopped touring in '65, they'd come back and go, "Whoa,"
Yeah, because Brian would be, for the audience that doesn't know, Brian would stay at home and work on the tracks. He'd write the songs and work with the Wrecking Crew. And, the tracks would be ready to go. The Beach Boys would just have to lay their vocals on top of them.
That's right. And initially it was just great for all concerned, because they came back and they did the Party album, and that's the album that had guest star Dean Torrance from Jan and Dean. He came in and did Barbara Ann with them, and that shot to #1. And that was kind of the old school Beach Boys style that everyone was so familiar with. And so it was girls surfing cars. And Barbara Ann was a girl, and it worked out great. And then they went to Summer Day, Summer Night, and it had California Girls on it. Help Me, Rhonda. Brian was still maintaining group expectations, but still trying to develop his craft in a way that it was kind of slowly, subtly getting in there. And then suddenly it wasn't subtle anymore. They come back from touring and it was Pet Sound.
Right.
And it was Wouldn't It Be Nice, God Only Knows, Sloop John B., songs, but there was introspective songs on there. One that Mike had to change, it was called Hang On To Your Ego, that Brian had written from, of all things, taking LSD.
Right.
And Mike was like, "Whoa, we can't put this in our records, because Beach Boy fans aren't people who relate to this. As far as we know, because the buying public was a demographic of 14 to mid-20s. And so if even that high up, that was kind of the beginning of the inner trappings of who they thought they were and who they wanted to be, and how they would continue to be successful by being artistic. And now, here we are in 2013, and time has shown us that the artistic stuff is as important and as cool as any other thing in their catalog.
We're talking to David Beard, editor of Endless Summer Quarterly, the Beach Boys fan magazine, and we're playing some of our favorite cuts from the new Made in California box set the Beach Boys released this past Tuesday. We played songs that had been commercially released, but this box set has plenty of songs that until now have never been released, and not many people know this, but before the 2012 reunion album, That's Why God Made the Radio, the Beach Boys got together in 1995 with producer Don Was, and were attempting to record some new songs. Now, the one I'm going to play is a song called Soul Searching. It's never been released before. Brian did a solo version of the song on his 2004 album, Getting In Over My Head, and he kind of flew in Carl's vocals and turned it into a duet. But here's the original Beach Boys version, and Brian's version is great, but this, hearing the guys all together again singing, this kicks it up a notch, and I think this is the superior version. Glad we have it on this new box set. All right, David, you're up next. Your favorite of the unreleased tracks on the Made in California box set.
The one song that I think is just that I've been waiting to hear for a long thing about, and everyone seems very interested. Most Beach Boy fans seem very interested in hearing is "Wouldn't It Be Nice to Live Again?" It's a song written and performed by the late Dennis Wilson.
And it's interesting because the title, "Wouldn't It Be Nice to Live Again?" is sort of a subtle nod, or maybe not so subtle, to a song that came out back in 1966. Wouldn't it be nice? Just in terms
I mean,
of the title.
when you think about the lyrics to the one from Pet Sounds, the one Brian wrote, "Wouldn't It Be Nice?" It's talking about getting older.
Right.
And so, I think in that regard, "Wouldn't It Be Nice to Live Again?" is kind of a further maturation of looking at life in that respect. And I think maybe in that it might be a little wink of an eye towards that original.
And it's such a brilliant song. We're going to get to it in a second, folks, I promise you. But you have to wonder why the heck this song was not on the Surf's Up album. I mean, the story goes that Dennis pulled the song from the album.
Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know if that's accurate. Dennis was all over Sunflower. I think part of what happened on Surf's Up was the group's dynamic of voting what tracks were going to go on the album because of Dennis's involvement on Sunflower in '70. He may have got a little obnoxious about it. Who knows? I don't know one way or the other, but my understanding is that they kind of pulled the reins back on him, and whoever they is in the group, however the voting went down, weren't in favor of more Dennis.
Well, luckily, as we talked about last time, Dennis Wilson is well represented on the box set. So here we go from the sessions for the Surf's Up album back in 1971, unreleased until now. Here are the Beach Boys with "Wouldn't It Be Nice to Live Again?" Wow, that's a great track. This half hour, we've been delving into the Made in California box set with Beach Boys fan and editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine, David Beard. David, as we wrap up here, what's coming up in the latest issue of Endless Summer Quarterly?
The new issue it turned out really, really nice. Dennis Dyken, drummer for the group The Smithereens, wrote a lovely piece on Surfin USA. It kind of focuses on 50 years ago, 1963. And that was a real pivotal time in the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean's history, because it was March of '63 that the group released, the Surfin USA album, and the single went to number 3. Mm-hmm. And it was to that point, the Beach Boys had not yet had a number 1 hit. So, by that time, they were doing shows with Jan and Dean, and before this, Brian played them Surfin USA. And this is before the album was released, and Jan and Dean wanted that song. Now, of course, you and I know that Sweet Little 16, written by Chuck Berry.
Sure.
And Dean, so I interviewed Dean about that, talking to Brian about trying to get Surfin USA, and that he would not give that to him. And he said, but I've got this other song called Goody Connie, Won't You Come Out Tonight? And then they retitled it Two Girls for Every Boy, and then they retitled it Surf City, which is the song that
right.
I'm sure your listeners would know it by that title. But, they kept saying to Brian, you really need to give us this other one, because Chuck Berry wrote that melody, Brian. That's not... Dean told me this, and it's a great interview. It's in the new issue. He says, you can't do that, Brian. We know Chuck Berry. And the reason they at least knew him is because they had done shows with him. So Jan and Dean both felt like, well, if we take this, we can at least contact Chuck Berry and say, hey, we wanted to do this. Is it cool? And Dean says in the interview that Brian's reply was, you can't have the song. My dad said it's okay. So Murray convinced Brian it was okay that he was taking Chuck Berry's song and making it his own.
Great advice.
So great advice. He was a sage, that father. Surfin USA is a great song for that group, and it was really a song that changed everything for that band. But it went to number 3, and then in June, Jan and Dean released Surf City, and in July 20th, 50 years ago, it held the number 1 position for 2 weeks, and it was the first Brian Wilson number 1 song. And so it's kind of, the upcoming issue of Endless Summer Quarterly is a celebration of Brian Wilson's writing. I mean, that's, because we discuss, I've got a little mini Q&A with Mike Love and David Marks about Surfin USA after Dennis Dykens' article. Then that leads into a little piece about the cover, the
right.
surfer on the album cover of Surfin USA. His name is Leslie Williams. So we have a little blurb from him. He's no longer with us. He died a few years ago. But this interview had taken place in 2003 time period, and it was conducted by Malcolm Searles, and it was running an issue of ESQ back in around 2003 time period. And I just grabbed that little bit about the cover and made a sidebar because I just kind of wanted to have it all kind of condensed together in one spot for the reader to be able to, get all the history. Then it goes into this interview, this really nice interview with Dean, talking about trying to extrapolate Surfin USA from Brian, because that's the song they wanted.
Right.
And, it's funny, because had they got their way, maybe Brian would have had the first number 1 surf pop hit if he had kept Surf City. And they never would have had a number 1 hit.
Yeah.
But because of it, Surfin USA, March 1963, I think that song just, talking about going to all the different surfing locations, that when Surf City comes out, a few months later, that's what the public was just waiting for.
Yep, absolutely.
And it would not have mattered who it was, because it was just like the perfect, you listen to those 2 songs next to each other, it's just like the perfect complementary.
Yeah.
Those are the 2 songs that you can say to anybody, and they may not know who does them, but most people know those 2 songs, even today. And most people probably think, "Oh, Surf City, yeah, I know that. That's the Beach Boys, right?" And it might as well be, because, and that's not a diss to Jan and Dean, but I mean, Brian wrote the song, the majority of it, and he already had the composition down.
And he's singing on it.
And he's singing on it. Yeah, I mean, it's a really telling interview with Dean Torrance. And then that just segues into what Dean's doing now, which is, working with the Bamboo Trading Company. Where finally I was able to, as executive producer of that project, I was able to interview all the guys and Dean about participating in that album and talking about it. And this felt like the right place and the right time to include those interviews, because it's Dean talking about Surf City, then it's Dean talking about what he just, is doing now musically. And so that worked out well. It was just it felt transitional. And I just felt weird writing about it or talking about it myself, because I was so heavily involved. So I just wrote an introductory paragraph that says, "I'm proud of this, and here the guys are going to tell you about it." About all I could do, really.
Well, I'll tell you what, that sounds like a cue. We'll play those 2 songs back-to-back, Surfin USA and Surf City. And David, thanks so much for being on the program.
Cool. Thank you so much.